Here we are. Okay, so in the early days of the pandemic, February 22nd, 2020, the Washington Post came out with this article discussing the potential for the initial SARS-CoV-2 virus to have an incubation longer than 14 days. A few months later, the CDC revised that report and suggested nonetheless that COVID had an incubation, the initial COVID virus had an incubation period of greater than 5 days. And what this meant for all intents and purposes is that for the last 2 years, we've all been living in some ways a reality that's similar to that described by Tabachman right there in Apocalypse of Ignorance. We don't know if we're a threat to others. We don't know if we're a threat to our family members, to people that we go out, shopping with, and so on. Because even though we might not have lost our sense of smell or, had a cough or a fever, we still might be one of these many asymptomatic carriers. So in a manner that's kind of similar to the AIDS crisis in the United States in the mid-1980s, this long incubation period, along with a lack of proper testing and coherent public health policies, meant that the virus quickly spread through the United States and through the world. And it forced us, as Tabachman's work, Apocalypse of Ignorance, suggests, to change our relationships with each other and the world around us. It also, incidentally, motivated some of the more draconian public health measures that I'll be talking about in the third class in this open seminar in a few weeks on biopolitics. So, given the fact that we've all been, once again, over the last 2 years, potential healthy carriers, I thought it'd be good today to ask two central questions of this really important figure. First, how did critics before the COVID-19 pandemic understand this figure? And we're going to do so through Priscilla Wald's great work, Contagious. And then how does this figure operate within the early literature of COVID-19, in which everyone, though some people more than others, were looked upon as potential carriers? So here's the general structure of today's class. First, we're going to have a brief introduction to Priscilla Wald's Outbreak Narrative, and we'll be discussing that through the figure of the super spreading stranger. And then we're going to apply that theory to Sally Mao's poem Batshit. And we're going to have a briefer introduction to Priscilla Wald's super spreading intimates, the other figure, the other possibility in the kind of general archetype of the healthy carrier. And we're going to apply that idea to Mona Awad's A Blue Sky Like This. And we're going to have a conclusion to the class. So let's begin. First, a recap of where we got here. As we discussed in the session last week, a dominant figure in cultural discussions of illness is Susan Sontag. And she develops this intriguing theory in the late 1970s about a difference, as she characterizes it, between illness as a biological condition and illness as a representation in narrative. What she suggests in part is that for a variety of reasons that we talked about last time, people at various historical moments have found illness to be an irresistible site of metaphor, turning that medical reality into a set of myths or fantasies or fables about either populations in the case of pandemics, or individual people in the case of non-communicable diseases. And while she doesn't invoke Sontag directly in the excerpts that you read for today, Priscilla Wald, professor of English and Women's Studies at Duke University, operates, I think, in a similar mode in her work that I had you read a bit of for today's session. That work is Contagious, Cultures, Carriers, and the Outbreak Narrative from 2007. Incidentally, if anyone out there is interested in writing about COVID literature or COVID culture, this work, despite the fact that it predates COVID, is one that I would strongly encourage you to have a look at. So like Sontag, she's operating in a similar mode. She's showing how illness serves, rather contagion, like illness, serves as a kind of irresistible site of myth-making, particularly about how communities are formed and the networks that communities create. As she writes on page 2 of the text that read for today, contagion is more than an epidemiological fact. It's also a foundational concept in the study of religion and society, with a long history of explaining how beliefs circulate in social interactions. The interactions that make us sick also constitute us as a community. So the point of her larger work is to sketch out what she characterizes the archetypal contagion story, which is what she characterizes as the outbreak narrative. And it has, in her research that she's done, situating the AIDS crisis in the United States alongside the more recent SARS crisis, well, the first SARS crisis of a couple of years ago. She says that despite the vast differences in these types of pathogens, the way in which they're talked about falls into a pretty general set of structures that looks an awful lot like the plot structure that we all learned in high school. That looks like that: inciting action, rising action, climax, falling action, and resolution. The plot begins by identifying a new pathogen, the inciting action, and then it moves swiftly forward and backwards in time, from the discovery of the pathogen to a kind of search for the pathogen's origin. It's kind of patient 0, and forward in time as the virus proliferates through particular communities. Then there's the introduction of various proposed containment strategies on the part of communities and government organizations. And ultimately, when the virus, when those containment strategies work, or the virus burns itself out, the identification of the end of the outbreak. But at each moment in the plot, including the inciting incident, the kind of rising action, climax, and resolution, the purely medical narrative, if you even believe that were to be possible, and Sontag would not, starts to pick up a number of other kinds of values as it develops. So consider this New York Times piece published at the end of the first wave of COVID. This is June 24th, 2020. And it's as the article suggests, it's a story of how the virus won. It opens with a description of what it intends to do, which is describe how the virus spun out of control. But the descriptions of the various super spreaders that operate within this story, this is one of those New York Times stories. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but as you scroll down, the graphic kind of changes. You can see, you could imagine the ways in which the network, the viral network, kind of like spreads out over the United States. The descriptions of these individual super spreader moments are far from neutrally discussed. In one moment, you can see this on the bottom of the screen, the bottom left. A woman celebrates Mardi Gras in New Orleans, and the graphic little dot travels from Memphis, Tennessee, down to New Orleans to celebrate, and then back to Memphis. And Memphis is kind of immediately overrun with the virus. Over here on the top right, you see a series of anonymized infected travelers who are characterized as dangerous sparks rather than figures who unwittingly brought and likely suffered from COVID upon arrival in the United States. And then you get the kind of political angle to it with Bill de Blasio, former mayor of New York City, encouraging New York City citizens to go out, get out of town, go out and enjoy themselves on March 2nd, juxtaposed with the visual image of the disease, COVID, spreading out into communities up and down the East Coast. So as more information is provided in each one of these cases, the narratives begin to take on moral and ethical and political shapes. And in doing so, they risk trafficking in the same kind of search for villains as the dominant AIDS narratives of the late 1980s, which kind of infamously cast Gaetan Dugas as a kind of villainous, super spreading patient zero of the AIDS epidemic. What Wald, who talks quite extensively about Dugas and about the SARS, the initial SARS outbreak, suggests is that there are really two kinds of asymptomatic carriers rather. There's the super spreading stranger, which is the one that she spends the vast majority of her time discussing. This figure is the archetypal stranger who embodies the danger of microbial invasion, as she puts it on page 10 of the readings for today. This person is a stranger that's othered in two kind of interrelated ways. First, that figure is typically geographically othered, coming in from outside a particular country, like those anonymized 1,000 asymptomatic carriers into the United States in the New York Times article. But in her reading of the SARS outbreak through the Newsweek examples on pages 5 through 8, she casts this particular stranger as someone who's not just from a different part of the world, but from a more primitive part of the world, in the case of the SARS example from those unhygienic chicken farms in China. And so this figure is associated with the primitive often, and at the same time has access to 20th and 21st century transportation networks that place the primitive in juxtaposition with the modern, oftentimes to negative political effects, as Wald characterizes it. That person is also psychologically othered. The carrier, unlike the figures within a particular community, presumably care about other members of their community, are either unwitting germ disseminators upon arrival or intentional dispensers of contagion. And although Wald characterizes it as a kind of a 50-50 split, her examples, particularly the Dugas example of AIDS, certainly the AIDS crisis of the 80s, certainly suggests that these figures are read pretty commonly across international boundaries as intentional dispensers of contagion. So it's here that I want to pause. And I want to spend some time, once again, having a longer discussion than we had last time about how the theory might interact with the COVID literature of the present. I want to do so through Sally Mao's Batshit poem. This is an incredibly fierce poem. It was published in a hurry in the wake of an attack on an Asian American woman in Brooklyn, New York on April 5th, 2020. She was hit in the face by some acid by a stranger walking by. And it was quickly understood within the larger kind of rise of anti-Asian xenophobia as a kind of manifestation of the general kind of Trumpian anti-Asian sentiment within the United States of that particular time period. The poem obviously deals with racism and ignorance, and we should certainly talk about that. But I want to frame the conversation through how racism is kind of activated by the prospect of the healthy carrier, the asymptomatic carrier. So how does the myth of the healthy carrier appear in Mao's poem, and what are its consequences? How is her speaker being geographically othered here, and how is she being psychologically othered? And then once we get the kind of negative discussion kind of firmly in place, I'm going to ask, how does Mao respond to these narratives? What argument is her poem making? And then finally, because this is one of the few poems that we'll be engaging with in the 5 sessions, what other questions or comments do you have about the poems? I want to pivot now from discussions of the healthy carrier stranger to discussions of the super spreading intimates. Now, I think Wald in her introduction and really kind of throughout the rest of Contagious spends more time characterizing the asymptomatic carrier as a stranger, with all of its kind of attendant xenophobic kind of qualities within the outbreak narrative myth. But she does raise at a few different points in the introduction the possibility that the healthy or asymptomatic carrier could be someone that's very close to you. Someone within that kind of Tabachman model of a parent to a child, or a child to a parent, or some member of a community to another. And in Contagious, she kind of talks about it a little bit on page 17, when she talks about Oedipus very provocatively as a kind of asymptomatic carrier. What she writes on page 17 is that human carriers teach, within the terms of the myth, teach the shared lesson of psychoanalysis and bacteriology, that human beings lack self-awareness. Like Oedipus, we do not know who or what we are. It is what makes us dangerous, and it mandates new codes of conduct. Now, I think the focus on Oedipus here can bring us a little bit closer to this other kind of healthy asymptomatic carrier, someone that's very close to us, like Oedipus, who's very close, obviously, as king of Thebes. So the questions, I think, that the super spreading intimate raise are related in some way to the questions of the super spreading stranger, but they aren't really kind of fully fleshed out by Wald, which is why, for those of you out there who are graduate students and undergraduates, I'd strongly encourage you, if you're interested, to write a conference paper on these particular figures. But I think some of the questions they raise with the Oedipus example being kind of front and center with Wald are asymptomatic characters guilty of spreading the virus, even if they do not know that they're actually carrying the virus? Within Sophocles' model, they very much are. I think within COVID-19 stories, that certainly remains to be determined. But then also, how do these figures shed light on the logic of social responsibility when it comes to communities that we know and care for? Priscilla Wald says again and again and again that communities are ultimately intimately related. Community building, community establishment is intimately related to the treatment of people under pandemic conditions. And it seems like that works not just for strangers, but it works in an even more intense way for intimates. So how I want to characterize this is through Mona Awad's A Blue Sky Like This, a really weird story. Weird in so many different ways, but I hope that you enjoyed it. Here's Mona Awad over here on the left. She's a Canadian-American young novelist. She's just published, I think, her second novel. They don't deal at all with the same kinds of issues that she discusses in this work from the Decameron Project. But if you've read it a while back or haven't had a chance to read it, I just want to give you a really quick recap of the plot and then ask a couple of questions about how it's modeling a kind of healthy carrier intimacy. So the strange feature of the plot, I think the weirdest formal feature of the plot, is that it's told in the second person narration, a very rare narration in which you become the narrator. Your name is Julia, as you find out about halfway through this story. And it's your birthday. And you have, on your birthday, decided to visit a particular shadowy clinic somewhere in New York City. There's a kind of science fiction-y aspect to the plot here, where early in 2020, roughly towards the end of the first wave of COVID, you go to this clinic to wipe your memories of everything that's come up beforehand. and I'm sure that plenty of you out there would like to do so. And as you're kind of navigating New York City as a kind of modern day Rip Van Winkle, you marvel at the deserted shops, the empty streets, the people wearing masks in taxi cabs, and so on. And you check your phone and you have a meeting set up with your ex, the Lord of Darkness, as he's characterized in your phone, who's going to meet you at a park in the city. And there you are incredibly confused to discover that he's sitting very far away from you. He's wiped down the bench. He's carried out all the early COVID protocols that we're all kind of quite intimately familiar with. And at a moment right near the end of the story, she reaches out to touch Ben's hand. This is after Ben had just kind of told her that he had broken COVID protocols because she was sobbing in her room. He had opened the door to show support for her. And under pandemic conditions, this is absolutely, not what you want to do to break out of your particular pod. Everyone in the park is horrified. And the narrator, who's got this kind of Pollyannish attitude towards the world, says, "This is just so tragic. What is there to be afraid of on a day like this, under a blue sky like this? Such a beautiful day." So there are a ton of ways we could kind of approach this story. I think it's a very interesting one. I think it teaches very well for those of you out there who are interested in teaching COVID literature yourselves. But some of the questions that I typically will ask my students when I teach this are, well, everyone wants to characterize Wald's narrator as a kind of COVID denier. And it's interesting and somewhat anachronistic to do so, I think, given the fact that it was published so early before a lot of the massive COVID denial in the United States took place in 2021. But if we can understand the second person narrator as also a kind of potential symptomatic carrier, how can we understand her as such, and how is she treated as such by others around her? And then once we can identify the fact that I think the carrier reading could happen, we could ask different questions about that reading, like what figurative or mythic aspects of Wald's asymptomatic character does the narrator hold? How is she kind of like Oedipus in that regard? And what is the story's attitude towards its speaker? Is it suggesting that this is a proper way to engage with COVID? Or is it asking us to read things ironically? And if it is, why is it framing it in the second person? Why is it telling us what we already think and then encouraging us to do otherwise? And then finally, how does the story shed light on the logic of social responsibility within the New York City community that was transformed during the pandemic? She's being nice to people, but at that particular point in New York City history, the ways in which you demonstrate kindness is actually to do the absolute opposite of what she's been doing. So these are the questions I want you to be thinking about. But I want to begin just by identifying a couple different moments in the text where we can kind of look at Julia, our second person narrator, as a potential asymptomatic carrier. Where do we see that in the plot? Other characters in the plot treating her as being someone who's potentially infected with the virus. So what are some ways in which we might kind of bring in Wald's characterization here of Oedipus as a figure that kind of fundamentally lacks self-knowledge, and the figure of the asymptomatic intimate being a figure that fundamentally lacks self-knowledge? To my mind, and I think this will continue to develop as literary critics and cultural figures start to write about COVID, I think the figure of the healthier asymptomatic character, I hope I've tried to show you how it structures not only public health decisions, which we'll talk about for next time, but it also, I think, plays an important role in the way that we tell ourselves stories about COVID-19. All of the characters and the vast majority of the stories that I've encountered have the potential to be an asymptomatic carrier, and very few people, actually, very few examples of the literature that I've encountered actually represent people being ill at all. It's very strange. The second thing I wanted to get across is that I think narratives that cast healthy carriers as strangers, and this is not just for COVID, this is certainly something that Wald would suggest as well, can have devastating effects upon certain other demographics within and beyond the United States. And that's why I wanted to show you the Mao batshit poem, which I think is beautifully fierce. And then finally, and I think most ambiguously, narratives that cast healthy carriers as intimates or community members can help to shape what it means to be a community. And this is to return to Wald's idea, the interactions that make us sick also constitute us as a community.